It is 10:30 in Central Europe. Welcome, everyone. Very happy to see you all here. I have to say that the title of this webinar, we struggled a bit to land on a catchy one because we had so much that we wanted to squeeze in there about the Western Taiga ecosystem and the importance of fire in that ecosystem and prescribed burning as a conservation strategy and about monitoring and data and assessment and about collaborative learning. So we have lots to share with you today. My name is Sara Estlander. I work for FOS Europe, who is hosting this webinar. At FOS, our mission is to boost the impact of nature conservation worldwide. And one of the ways that we do that is by helping practitioners to learn together about what works and what doesn't, and learning how to learn about those things. And today's webinar is an example of that. We have some excellent speakers lined up for you today. First, Nico Boenisch from FOS Europe will set the scene for you, framing the context for this work. Then we have Anders Heurlin from County Administrative Board of Dalarna, who will transport us to the forests of the Western Taiga and show us what fire means in that ecosystem. Then we have Linnea Wängdahl from FOS Europe, who will put all of that into neat boxes for us so we can understand how it works. And finally, we have Julia Carlsson from the County Administrative Board of Västmanland, who will tell us what this exercise has meant in practice for data collection and about what's coming up in the future of this work. And we'll be done in about an hour and 15 minutes. A couple of words about how we'll be working today. We have the chat open for a bit longer, but we'll close that in a bit, and then we'll ask you to use the Q&A button, question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom window to type in your questions. You can also upvote questions from there, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time for, either in writing or at the end of the session. And to not make it a one-way street, we will also be asking questions of you from time to time in the form of polls that will pop up in your Zoom window. Those are good moments to reflect a little bit about what you've heard and try to make a connection to your context. We are recording this session, and we will share this recording within a few weeks so that you can rewatch it and share it with others who might be interested. And we'll email that link to you when it's available, and also put it on this web page that is listed here. With that, we are ready for our next speaker, our first speaker, I should say, which is Nico Boenisch, who is the co-director of FOS Europe. Let's try to, there we go, yes, he's ready to share. Nico aims through his work to build adaptive management capacity in the conservation community, and recently he's been focusing strongly on evidence-based learning about conservation strategies. Over to you, Nico.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks for all of you to be here. It's very exciting to see so many attendees, and also, of course, thanks for all the Life2Taiga colleagues to be here and making the time to share with all of you. I'd like to kick us off with a bit of context on a slightly higher level. So I'll take you back from actually prescribed burning for a moment and talk more generally about restoration and collaboration for a moment to set the scene. Probably the majority of people here on this call is very aware of the principles underpinning ecological restoration. And I'm not going to talk through these one by one. Feel free to look at them while I speak, but I want to highlight a few things to kind of frame for us what some of the, let's say, challenges, but also key principles are that we have to keep in mind when we're doing restoration work. One is restoration only works with a diverse set of actors that do something together. That can be, you know, private companies, it can be local communities, it can be indigenous communities, depending on where we are. It can be government authorities on different levels, etc., perhaps research institutions. And all these involve people and actors, of course, don't always necessarily have the same interpretation of what we're trying to do with a given restoration action. What the desired impact is, how it's supposed to work, what we're exactly after, what really the action is. I think in the moment where different people and actors are involved, of course, that's a natural thing that happens. Also, because different actors and people are involved, there is a diverse understanding of, on the one hand, the issue at hand, and also what kind of knowledge and sources of data and types of data are actually available, what the information needs are in order to take an action well and to know what you're doing and what you're aiming for. There are often data gaps. There are varying data quality depending on who and what is involved and how long the practice at a given site already happened, etc. Yeah, sometimes this data is not consistent. So that means also data collection, analysis, and so on to understand what of that we're doing here is actually working. The processing of it, the combining it is not always easy. And that's especially the case because, of course, ecosystems are also not easy. They're actually complex systems, and we don't necessarily have also the full understanding scientifically of how all the processes and functions and structures of an ecosystem actually interact with each other and what we're trying to achieve here. So it comes down to, landing on a joint interpretation of that and trying to structure that. And that, therefore, it's so key to have clear goals, to kind of set clearly what is our interpretation of what success of a restoration measure actually looks like. So we're enabling ourselves to practice adaptive management and to ask, is the stuff that we're doing here actually working? But also to learn over time and kind of apply some of the things we're finding out in particular projects, in particular efforts, and apply them to other contexts. So it's not surprising also, I'm sure many of you are fully aware of the standards of practice to guide ecosystem restoration. It's not surprising that at the core here is adaptive management, information sharing, broad engagement, and also, of course, that there's some kind of system to, on the one hand, assess what actually the situation is we're working on, to then plan and design what you're doing and kind of over time close that cycle of adaptive management. These standards heavily draw on other standards that, again, might be very familiar to many of you for conservation, the open standards for the practice of conservation, that, as you can see here, of course, use very similar steps and approaches. So the message I'm trying to give here is, for restoration practice, but also conservation practice, that's all really key. But this is not where I'd like to stop, because adaptive management is, of course, one thing, and we practice that for a given project, for a given site. But what if we're actually doing the same action across many different places, and we would pull our brains, we would pull our data, we would pull our learning and understanding and evidence in order to figure out together how we can take that action better. And that's really the situation that we're dealing with here, and what we're sharing with you today for prescribed burning in the taiga ecosystem, an action that many people are taking at many different sites where we're collecting data since a long time, and we have an opportunity to put that together and learn together. So therefore, I want to talk a bit about also collaborative learning. And in that conservation community, many different people and actors, we at FOS, but also many others, think a lot about how can we make sure that we actually learn from each other, that we're not keeping our data, our evidence, our knowledge and insights in, let's say, our silos, but that we find a way to put that together and to combine all kinds of different sources of evidence so we can find out together how which actions actually work, so our practice can be collectively improved. A lot of that thinking we have done in the context of what we call the Conservation Learning Initiative, but there's many more people and material, of course, that led to that and that builds on that and so on. But it is an interesting resource, perhaps, to go to if you want to know more about it. The key thing that we have done in the context of this work is that we've developed a 5-step approach for collaborative learning in conservation that is organized by these 5 steps. So on the one hand, we need to understand what are we actually trying to learn about. then we need, based on that, we need to formulate learning questions and assumptions that we can test with evidence, data, information, knowledge, wisdom of all people involved, diverse sources. Then we need to collect the available evidence, assess that, and actually compile it in such a way that we can, on the one hand, draw learning from it. So like practically feasible, applicable learning that actually matters for practice. And on the other hand, it will, of course, inform how we're defining that learning topic moving forward and shaping that, because we might find out about a few things that we by now understand. We want to ask other things moving forward. So it's, of course, a continuous collaborative process. With all that in mind, we try to apply that to the Life2Taiga project. So as I said, to a community that is practicing the same action across many different places, and that now kind of defines, on the one hand, what is it really that we're trying to learn about, and what are the questions? So these first two steps are, of course, really key. What are the questions that would really help us in our practice if we were able to answer them? And I'd like to highlight one tool and then hand over. Then finally, you can hear actually about the Taiga ecosystem and not anymore about the theory behind what we're doing. But one tool I'd like to highlight before that is the theory of change. Because what we're doing with the theory of change diagram is we're using that to define how does that action that we're all collectively taking look like. So what are we doing, but also what kind of effects do we like to see from that, and how does it make a difference for the ecosystem we care about? And then also how we use that to anchor our learning questions and assumptions in that. So that looks something like that. You will see more of that later on in the presentation. But just to highlight a few key things, if we're taking a restoration action, it comes down to conditions at a given site that we have selected, both abiotic conditions, but also the initial state of biodiversity, of structures, of species there. Then if we take a restoration action, of course, that comes with certain conditions of how we take that action. So the action can have direct and indirect effects on the ecosystem itself and lead to either enhancement, maintenance, or restoration of structures, functions, and processes, and therewith also species that depend on them in the system. And you can see here, this is of course just illustrative. In that analysis, in that mapping of our joint understanding of what we're trying to do here, we're anchoring learning questions and assumptions that we can test with data and information. And that enables us, of course, also to harmonize what data we collect, to fully have a joint understanding of the information needs we have, and process the data in an informed way later on. So much as an introduction, and I'm handing over back to you, Sarah, to take it from there.
Yes, thanks very much, Nico. This is very helpful for understanding the context that we're talking about here. Remember that you can send in questions using that Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Before we move on, we want to get a bit of a feeling of who's in the audience and what prescribed burning means in your context. So there should now be a poll popping up on your screen where you can choose one of these answers. Which of these applies to you? What does prescribed burning mean? What is it used for in your context? I'll give you a minute here to answer. So let's end it here and let's see what you said. So it is mostly about restoration and a little bit about prevention in those contexts that it's being used. With that, let's travel to the forests of the Western Taiga and get the fire going. Anders Heurlin is the manager of protected areas in Sweden, working at the County Administrative Board in Dalarna. And he mostly works with the restoration of forests and has been working with prescribed fire for about 10 years. Take it away, Anders.
All right. Thank you so much. It's interesting to have an audience of practitioners, and hopefully this webinar will be inspiring for your future work. I'm gonna share my screen. And I think we should be okay. Now, the Western Taiga ecosystem is a part of the boreal forest, which is a circumpolar biogeographical region reaching from Norway, Sweden, Finland, through Russia, into Alaska, and all across Canada. In Europe, it's dominated by coniferous forests, with Scots pine as the key tree species. There's also quite a bit of spruce forests and deciduous trees like birch and aspen. This talk will focus on pine forests. These forests are in the natural state, frequently exposed to reoccurring low-intensity fire, where the old trees typically survive, and the younger generation will get thinned out or scarred. In this way, the fire will keep the pine forests open and warm, and the fire will also create important substrates for species adapted to this disturbance. Looking at Sweden, we know through dendrochronological studies that the forests have experienced fire cycles of about 50 to 150 years. That means that any given pine forest would have burned every 50 to 150 years, on and on, repeatedly. We also know that 1 to 2% of the forest area burned every year, meaning that the fires used to be big. Today, as a reference, only 0.01% burns on a regular basis. So we have a huge difference in burned area now compared to before. Now, these fires have really shaped the forest structures. Low-intensity fires create multi-corded pine stands with little or no spruce. It leaves the youngest surviving trees scarred and makes them produce resins that will impregnate the wood. As the trees grow old and finally dies, the dead wood will be resilient to decomposure and can last hundreds of years as substrates for wood-living fungi, lichens, and other threatened species. The fire also attracts pyrophilic insects that thrive among the dead trees. Since about 1850, we started to put out the wildfires in Sweden. Basically, this was because the forests were of high economical value as timber. We've continued with this practice, and prescribed fire is now crucial for reaching favorable conservation status. And we've been burning for about 25 years. And focus has been on getting the job done and to build capacity and skills within our organizations. Once this was settled, though, other questions arose. What actually happens when we burn different forests? What results do we get? What does a healthy pine forest look like? And how many burns or years does it take before we get there? Since the last big fire year in Sweden was about 150 years ago, our forests today don't look like or behave the way that they should. Now, this search for a functional, healthy pine forest became somewhat a quest for the Holy Grail. So basically, what we did was that we defined this long-term state as a few key structures. Multi-corded stands, tree species diversity, forests with sufficient stand openness, sunny patches, trees with fire scars, lots of diverse deadwood of high quality, and thin humus layers. We also made the assumption the presence of these key structures would lead to a diversity in key species. So, what does a healthy pine forest look like? Well, this picture will serve as an example of such a forest. The picture is taken in Russia, where forests with intact fire regimes still exist. We can see open forests with pines of all ages, we see birch, mix of birch trees, high quality deadwood, and thin humus layers. This is what we believe our long-term desired state should look like, and what we're striving for with our prescribed burns. So now that this desired state was defined, we had another questions. How can we get there? This is a schematic trajectory or a theory of change that describes the way from the starting point to the desired state. And we know it's going to take several burns and decades of hundreds of years before the forest reach this long-term desired state. But the key structures will improve with each burn. Now, we typically burn 3 types of forest stands in Sweden. We burn young forests of about 50 years old. The forests are dense, homogeneous, and have very little or no biological diversity at all. The majority of our burns are middle-aged forests. Fairly dense still, typically regenerated after the last big fire year. They have some deadwood of high quality and some biological diversity. Lastly, we burn old-growth pine forests that are typically multi-cohorted with really old trees and a dense younger generation. These forests are full of high-quality deadwood and really high biological diversity with threatened species. When we do our burns, we use different prescriptions and have different goals depending on the forest types we burn. In category A forests, we focus on reducing the density of the stand, that is, accepting a high mortality. Since there isn't any biological diversity in these forests, we can burn it hard. Surviving pine trees are easily scarred. Category B forests use a similar prescription with focus on fairly high mortality. However, care has to be taken to really old trees in the stands, and we also need to protect a few substrates, such as logs and snags. Finally, the category C have to be burned with great care. The goal here is to reduce the density of the younger generation while keeping the old trees alive. This means that the burn days should be carefully selected so that the fire doesn't get too intense. In these forests, we have to work quite a bit to protect lots of substrates with red listed species. Now, the following slides, we show some pictures of different burns that we've done there in the last 3 to 5 years. They're all about 30 hectares large. Now here's a photo of a category A burn. We see a high mortality, about 40%, which is patchily distributed over the whole area, creating lots of sunny patches. Plenty of fire scars on the pines that survived. Overall, a good result. This is a burn of a middle-aged forest, category B. Mortality is slightly less, about 25%, also creating sunny patches. Since pine trees are fully grown at this point, it takes higher intensity to get the heat up in the crowns to kill off the trees. Also, older pines are more difficult to scar than young ones, since they have much thicker bark than the young trees. We see some charred logs close to the road, which will be valuable substrates for fungi and lichen in the years to come. So, what about the old growth pine forest, category C? The goal here was to reduce the younger generation while keeping the old trees alive. It worked fairly well. Amount of pounds in the younger generation was reduced by 70% about, but the old trees also got reduced by 30%, which is too much. Protection of valuable substrate worked just fine by removing the fuels around the structures to be saved. Burning category C forests is really difficult if the goal is to thin the younger generation while leaving the old generation intact. Right. So if we go back to the structures and the search for the Holy Grail, do we find it anywhere after Womburn? Cat grey forest, no grail. We get sunny patches and trees with fire scars. That's about it. Not so surprising. The bee forests, no grail. In addition to sunny patches and fire scars, we also see some diverse deadwood of high quality, which is very valuable for threatened species in years to come. But overall, we're still quite far from the long-term desired state. When burning the category C forests, things start to look much more interesting. It's grayish. We have trees of many generations. We find plenty of high-quality deadwood, and we're starting to see sufficient stand openness and thin humus layers. But there's still a lack of tree species diversity. And what about our assumption that structures leads to key species? For the younger forests, we find paraphilic insects. They come the same day as we burn, and pretty much anywhere in the landscape. Middle-aged forest adds some mycorrhiza fungi, thanks to the trees being fairly old. And in the old-growth forest, we also see some interesting deadwood fungi. So in general, the model seems to work pretty well, although the quest for the Holy Grail will have to continue for many decades to come. And I will end my presentation there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anders. We really feel like we are there now in the forest, feeling the scent and looking at these charred stems here. Next, we will put Linnea Wängdahl on the stage. She will show us how this project took all of this knowledge and organized it in a way that can be used for learning. Linnea works at FOS Europe and has been part of this project since 2023. She's a conservation biologist based in Hälsingland in Sweden, and she's a big fan of taiga forests. Go ahead, Linnea.
Thank you for that. So what I was saying is that I would like to take us through the steps that we took together as a team in this project. So I want to take us back first to the 5 steps of the collaborative learning process that Nico was telling us about in the beginning. Just to kind of highlight that the step that we took together here was really about step 2, about developing the learning questions. So the first thing that we did here was to really create a theory of change, detailed theory of change, where we highlighted the impacts that we think prescribed burning has on the Western Taiga, both directly in the short term, but also indirectly in the long term. And once we have that detailed theory of change, we're able to use that as a framework to identify where the key knowledge gaps and assumptions lay. And based on those, we developed our learning questions. So I want to now talk you through a kind of high-level version of the theory of change that we created. And starting out to the right here, we see the beautiful Western Taiga ecosystem. So you can kind of imagine those photos that Anders just shared with us now. And here we captured the kind of structures and the species that we really care about in the Western Taiga ecosystem. So starting out with the stand composition, as Anders was mentioning, we're looking for those open sunny patches, this open diverse stand composition with a diversity in tree age, a certain species composition. We're looking for a low percentage of spruce. And when it comes to the ground layer, we're really looking for that thin humus layer with even some patches of completely bare exposed mineral soil. And then we have these beautiful fire affected trees. So we want to have this kind of diverse deadwood available for species. So we want to have deadwood of different ages, of different stages of decay, of different qualities. And all of these structures are really key for many of the species that live in the Western Taiga. So they are the structures that we want to see maintained or enhanced. And in this case, we want to restore them by implementing a natural disturbance in the form of prescribed burning. And now with any kind of restoration action, one of the first decisions that you need to make is which sites am I going to restore? In this case, which sites are we going to burn? So you assess the sites based on the initial stand structure. So you're really looking at the condition of all of these structures and species. How are they doing at the starting point? As Anders was saying, we divided up these kind of initial stand structures, these starting points, into 3 different categories. So you have your younger stands, your middle-aged stands, and your older stands. And it's really important that you select sites from all of these different categories in order to make sure that you keep consistently developing and maintaining high-quality sites throughout the forest landscape. And once you've selected your sites, it's time to start designing your restoration action or designing your burn. And now you're setting your goals and your objectives for both the long term and the short term. You're setting objectives that are measurable. For example, as Anders was saying, the mortality of trees, the initial mortality of pine, of spruce, of deciduous trees. And you're basing those objectives on the initial stand structure. So you're setting your goals for where you want to go. And you're also taking into consideration these abiotic factors at the time of the burn. So how dry is the ground? What's the fuel characteristics like? What's the weather like? What's the topography like at the site? Because all of these things will impact the fire behavior. And then it's time to burn. So your burning or your restoration action will have certain qualities. It will have a certain intensity and a certain hardness. And that intensity and hardness directly influences what the direct effects of the fire will be. So on the day that you're burning, the days after, the coming weeks, you will start to instantly affect the stand at your site. So the stand composition will be instantly impacted by direct tree mortality. You're starting to change the stand composition. The ground layer will be impacted by the humus layer being reduced by the fire, in some cases even exposing completely bare mineral soil. And you'll get these fire-affected trees. Some are injured in the roots or the stems or the crowns, but they're still surviving, but they're impacted by the fire. And you have these pyrophilic species, these insects are starting to arrive. So all of this is happening directly as you're burning and in the coming days and weeks. But this is also starting to have an impact on the indirect effects of the fire. So in the coming years, the coming decades, in the coming centuries after you burn, you will have these indirect effects. So you will have pioneer tree species that are starting to establish themselves, and you will have these fire-affected trees. Some of them have been injured in the roots, so they start dying and falling in the next couple of years coming up. And you will have some trees that have been affected by the fire, perhaps developing these fire scars that Anders mentioned, that will put them on the trajectory to becoming really high quality dead wood further down the line. So all of these things are happening directly after the fire, but also in the coming years and decades after your fire. So this was kind of a high-level version of the theory of change that we created. I want to also show you a detailed version. You won't be able to see it very well, but don't worry about that. I want to just show you the kind of level of details that we put into this. And once you have this detailed theory of change, this is where you're able to start mapping out the knowledge gaps, the information needs, and the assumptions that we have. And based on those, we created our learning questions. And I want to spend the next 45 minutes just talking through the learning questions that we have. Starting with the first learning question, which is really about the stand composition, this openness of the stand that we're after. How do we actually achieve that stand openness? So when you're designing the burn, you're setting your objectives for a certain level of initial tree mortality. But in order to know what kind of initial tree mortality to aim for, you really need to understand the indirect tree mortality. So which factors actually have the biggest effect on the indirect tree mortality? So a couple of years after the fire, some trees with injured roots will start to die, but trees will also die due to insect outbreaks that could be induced by the stress level of the trees. They could die due to storms or droughts. And you really need to understand which factors have the biggest impact. Because if you are conducting your burn when the ground is so dry that many of the tree roots are injured, then perhaps too many of the pine trees will start dying as indirect effects of the fire. So you end up losing too much pine. So it's really important in order to be able to design your burn to understand these indirect effects of fire. And the second question is about these fire-affected trees. We keep talking about these fire scars, and the reason is that they are important because they will put a tree on a trajectory into becoming really high-quality dead wood after a couple of decades or even centuries. So at what age of a pine tree's life does it need to be exposed to fire for the first time in order for it to actually develop these fire scars? As Anders was mentioning, if we burn a middle-aged tree for the first time, perhaps it needs to burn with a harder intensity, or perhaps be manually scarred beforehand in order for it to be damaged enough to start developing these fire scars. So that's another important question. And the third one is about the relationship between fire hardness, so how deep into the ground the fire burns, and the recruitment of pioneer tree species. So you measure the fire hardness by understanding how much of the humus layer that was reduced. And if your fire is too shallow, it could be that you come back after a couple of months after your burn and you see that your lingonberries, your other kind of dwarf shrub species are still there and still thriving. So perhaps your fire was too shallow to be able to make room for these pioneer species. So to really understand this relationship between fire hardness and tree recruitment, and also to understand how to best measure fire hardness, is a really important question. And the last two questions are really about fire-dependent species. So the first one of those is about the directly fire-dependent species. So we talked earlier about selecting your sites based on the initial stand structure, but you also need to select your sites based on where they're situated in the landscape. So the assumption that we have here is that by accumulating or connecting burn sites, we will have a higher impact on these key species rather than spreading these burns widely across the landscape. But that's an assumption that needs to be tested. And the last learning question is about the species that are dependent on this specific substrate, this high quality deadwood that's impacted by fire. So what if we actually manually go in and damage the trees to mimic a fire? Would that actually have an effect on these? Could these species actually thrive on those kind of substrates as well? So that's the last question that we had. So just based on creating this theory of change and mapping out what we think happens after a fire, we were able to pinpoint our key knowledge gaps and develop these learning questions. And this helps us to understand what kind of data we need to have in order to start answering these learning questions. But I'm going to leave that part of the story over to Julia. And I think I'll end my screen share now. And it's time for another poll, I believe, Sarah.
That is correct. Thank you very much, Linnea.
Thank you.
And now we know exactly what we want to know about all this. And as Linnea said, before we move on, we have another poll for you. And this time you can choose more than one option. Perhaps that should have been possible in the first one as well. And this is kind of tying back to what Nico was saying in the beginning about the challenges of assessing outcomes of restoration work. Which ones of these resonate with you? What's difficult about assessing the outcomes? I'll give you a minute again to react to this one. Okay, it looks like it's slowing down here, so let's see what you have responded here. I'm going to end it here, and this is what it looks like. It's pretty evenly distributed. Complex monitoring methods is in the lead, but the rest are quite quite even across the board here about inconsistency of data, too many indicators, not knowing how to assess them, and measuring the wrong things. With that, it is time for our last presenter. And our final speaker today, Julia, will touch on some of these challenges and tell us more about what we've learned, both for practice and for continuing to learn going forward. Julia is the project manager for the Life2Taiga project, which is now on its 3rd year out of 6.
That's right.
Take it away, Julia.
Thank you. So it was actually quite a good list of different challenges from the monitoring processes that we just saw in the poll, because we've been struggling a lot with those different parts. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we've been using all this theoretical work that you've seen now, and try to incorporate it into our monitoring scheme. So first, to say something about our project, as Sarah mentioned, it's a 6-year-long project, and it's mainly focusing on nature conservation through prescribed burning. So we've had a previous project just before this one that was Life2Taiga, and now it's Life2Taiga. And there we had 14 partners participating, which was county administrative boards from all over Sweden. And I'm coming back to what we challenged in the previous project, but just to continue now on what we've heard from the previous speakers. In this phase, we were really asking ourselves, like, how should we develop the monitoring scheme based on those identified learning questions and the theory of change that we mapped out? So I should change my slide here. What should we measure to find the answers? So going back to those structures that Anders had shown you already, we identify those structures that are part of the fire-adapted pine forest and which we want to create or maintain. And the first 3 are about stand composition, and we have about soil and about more fire-affected structures of the trees, and we have the species. So we then identified several indicators, and those indicators, they are both like site assessment indicators that help assess the site and how we should design the burns. They are fire behavior indicators, and they are indicators for effectiveness and learning, how to stimulate such outcome. And we have identified a lot of learning needs and challenges, as you already saw. But in this previous project, we didn't, unfortunately, we didn't really end up with a joint monitoring scheme that everyone was following. There was a big discussion in the beginning of the project, and we struggled a bit with choosing the ambition level, and there was this national manual that we sort of decided to use, but it was it turned out that it wasn't really coordinated. So everyone was measuring like some indicators and using some methods that they preferred, which made it difficult to draw conclusions in the end of the project on the national level. It was very time-consuming and complicated measurements. It took a lot of time in field. And there was also a lack of connection between the knowledge gaps, what we really needed to find out, and what parameters that were measured. So it's quite similar to the poll we just saw. So what we wanted to emphasize was, like, can the measurements give more correct information to evaluate the burning result? That was like the main aim. And we saw that both using those more complicated measurements, but also that staff use their visual judgment in field to draw conclusions on fire intensity and hardness and how it affected the burning results and the goal achievement, rather than using this complicated monitoring manual that we had. So then how to create a more relevant and pragmatic and efficient monitoring process that would actually be conducted. And how could we set the goals and adapt them to the given condition in a specific burning site? So I posed some questions here from the group. So we wanted to increase the motivation so that the monitoring was actually conducted, so that the staff could see a better link between the measurements that they made in field and how that data should be used. We wanted to facilitate and coordinate the monitoring performance. We wanted to create a systematic, unbiased, and feasible monitoring without being researchers, but still. And we wanted to improve the goal formulations. And we also wanted to capture this knowledge and expert judgment into the monitoring process to get use of all the experiences that staff have. And we wanted to ensure that we create a meaningful learning to improve the practice. So what did we then need to know about the forest? Well, we need to know the initial state, like the current status of the forest that we should burn. We wanted to know something about the fire behavior during the burning. We wanted to understand if a result is achieved and also being able to evaluate that. We wanted to understand if one result leads to another. And we wanted to see if certain factors are influencing the ability to achieve a specific result. So quite a lot of questions here. And we combined a lot of information from this theory of change into a table, which we're going to have a glimpse of, to see like have some clarity of the purpose of the monitoring to emphasize the objectives. So then we, looking at all the indicators and parameters and what to measure, we really wanted to make sure that we were measuring the right thing and that we actually needed the data from that indicator. So justifying why we are measuring certain things. So this was rather a big table that I've tried to simplify. So first we have the information need, which basically is our learning question. And then like what should we measure? The indicator that says something about the structure in the forest that we're aiming for. How is, of course, what method to use for a specific parameter or indicator. Where should we measure it? Should it be in a plot, which we have distributed along the burning site, or should it be for the whole site? And when? Should it be before, during, after, or on a long-term phase after the fire? So I'm giving you some examples here, and I know it's in text, but I'll just highlight a few of them. So looking, for instance, at our learning question regarding stand openness, then we decided to use those order photos that you just saw Anders showing on how the mortality actually was after fire. So those photos are used on the whole site, and we are looking at them just both before and after on a long term after fire. And we also look at the stem density to say something about the openness, and that's measured in the plots. Moving to the third one, we had a question about when is it too dry to burn, and that has to do with the fuel moisture. So then we realized that we can actually trust the DC and DMC values from the fire weather index looking at this, which would then be done for the whole site because those values are for the whole site. And that's done during the burn or before. We're following it the days before we decide on the burning date. Did we achieve any humus layer consumption? Well, then we decided that we would be fine with looking at the descriptions on impact, or that we describe how we think the impact has been on the humus layer. And we also decided on some classes for fire depth instead of doing those complicated measurements, which was sometimes we actually ended up having more humus thickness than before the fire due to wrong bias in the measurements. And just highlighting some of the things that we improved then. So in the old manual, for instance, looking at the last row here in the table, in the old manual, for looking at the humus layer consumption, we were putting those 100-meter long transects with points every 10th meter or something like that, measuring the mosses and the lichen layers and so on, which we just thought was way too much work for the results that it gave. So instead, we decided to lean on those descriptions. So that was just one example of how we've tried to simplify things, but still make sure that we get some good indicators that we can trust. So the objectives with the monitoring, as I mentioned, it was to conduct measurements and observations before, during, and after the burning. So we wanted to describe the site and the performance and the effect of the burning. And we want to be able to evaluate the burning goals so that we can improve the planning for the burning and decisions and choice methods. So I've made a little schematic overview here. Before the burning, we tried to make an inventory of the site, like the site conditions and structures that we have before the fire, the initial state. And we describe all this in a burning plan together with the security measures and also where we are placing the hoses and the water pumps and so on. So this burning plan is shared with the fire rescue services. During the burning day, we are monitoring the weather conditions, ignition patterns that we are using, and the fire intensity and hardness. Directly after, or 3 to 12 weeks after the prescribed burning, we're looking at the initial results and the goal achievement from that first state after the burn. And on long term, approximately 7-10 years after the fire, we revisit the site and look at the long-term results and the mortality and the goal achievement. So those first 3 phases, then we also make species inventories in different time zones. But we conclude what we have, describing the site and also describing the burning day and the initial results in a burning report. The long-term effects are also described in a known report. And we use this manual is developed. We both have a manual with instructions and where the motives are described. And then we have the protocols, both digital ones to use in field, or if you want to have a paper version. So what have we achieved now that we have revised our monitoring manual? I think that we can conclude that we have strengthened the link between the knowledge gaps that we have identified through those learning questions and the data collections, so that we can we have identified what do we really want to learn with using this whole model. We have facilitated and coordinated the monitoring, and the staff knows why they are measuring things in a much more clarified way. I think we have achieved much more systematic, unbiased, and feasible monitoring that can be conducted during one day in field, which leads to that monitoring is actually being performed and in a better way. So we're really happy about that. And I also think that we can conclude that we have improved our goal descriptions so that we can actually evaluate the goal achievement. And I think this has been really helpful to strengthen the motivation for conducting monitoring and to really capture the learning for the entire project. And just going back to this model that Nico shared in the beginning. So we've been working a lot with step 1 and 2 together with FOS, defining the learning topic and the learning questions. And now we're moving forward in this circle. So we have improved the manual, as I mentioned. And the next step, I think, will be to actually conduct the long-term monitoring in older burnings. So we'll go back to sites which were burned like 7 or 10 years ago. We will look at what previous data there were from those sites, and we will analyze how the monitoring data that we now are collecting, if it answers the learning questions. And then if we need to, we will revise the monitoring manuals. So quite a lot of work ahead as well. I wanted to invite Anders here. If you like looking at this previous slide, from your perspective as a practitioner, what's your conclusion after we've been revising this monitoring manual? Is it, yeah, what do you think that we have achieved in the project?
Well, I think we've achieved a couple of good things. I think we have a solid manual that really works, that everybody agrees on and can work with. Like a couple of details that really changed the way we measure and what we measure is that we added a couple of things, like stem density, to measure like the density of the forest. How many trees do we have per hectare rather than the basal area of the living trees? We also skipped the part of measuring humus thickness, since we had really hard time to get good data measuring this. Now we think that humus layers should be sufficiently thin, and we know that they thin out for every burn we do. And I think in being a manager planning burns, I think the big picture, the long-term desired state, is the most important breakthrough, sort of. We get the big picture, we know what we're aiming for, and we know that substrates will enhance with every burn, basically.
Yeah, thank you. So sort of wrapping up with that, we can recommend that it's worthwhile going through this process, using those different steps and looking in detail, creating this theory of change. It has definitely been beneficial for our project and for revising our monitoring. So thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Julia. It's really inspiring to see how it all comes together for practitioners to use. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have a bunch of questions in that Q&A panel. Nico, are you ready to take some questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think so. So there are some that, thanks to the other panelists, some that we said we want to answer live. So I'll go to some of these in a second, but actually I'd like to start with one that is just upvoted the most at the moment, which is a question from Sylvia. By the way, apologies if I pronounce names in the wrong way. I'll do my best. The aim of prescribed burning is open habitats, but after the burn, you get a thick regrowth of birch. How to avoid that? Is that something that either you, Julia, or Anders could respond to?
Yes, we can, I think. Now, I think we see different results depending on what forests we burn. Where I live, up in mid-Sweden, we rarely seen thick birch regeneration. We only see that when we get really high intensity and kill off all the trees. And at the same time, we get a really deep burn. Then we get lots of birches. We don't consider that a problem though, because that will actually regrow to a deciduous forest, which is habitat is really lacking in Sweden, in our taiga forests. And I think as you burn that forest 30 or 40 years after, you thin out this birch and you get some really nice habitat.
All right, thank you, Anders. Yeah, and there comes in again I think I answered in writing to one of the questions. There comes in, of course, the combination of these different stand categories that Anders presented in the beginning, where on the one hand, there's and also, of course, Linnea talked about, there's a trajectory, of course, from one to another, but also the diversity of these different categories in the landscape overall, in the ecosystem overall. If you zoom out and look at all of the taiga ecosystem, is actually beneficial and valuable to have, because they develop in different other categories, and we need the diversity for different structures, functions, and processes, and with that species to be in place. So thanks for that, Anders. Then perhaps I'll go to the question of T. Parker Sherman. I'm sure the RX burn windows are really small, seasonality, timing, growing season versus dormant season, etc. That must be an incredible challenge. How to choose the right time frame to create the end and results in mind. Is that you are? Yeah,
I can take that. Yeah, you're right. The burned windows are really small in Sweden. Our summers are wet, and our fuels dry really slow as well. Mosses retain moisture for a long time, so we have a problem with our burn windows. The season is mid-May to mid-August, and depending on where you are in Sweden, you get perhaps a handful, 10 burn days during the summer, or up to 15, 20, 30 burn days. So you really have to watch the weather and make your best decisions with the weather you have. 2024 season, we could only burn in late May because the weather was too rainy in the whole summer, basically. So yeah, really short windows.
Thank you, Anders. Then perhaps a question. Where is it? I need to find it. Somebody asked about if oak forests were also burned. As I'm not able to find the question anymore.
I answered it in text.
Oh yeah, you did answer it. Okay,
so
fantastic.
in the very south of Sweden, we are burning some mixed oak and pine stands.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so you can continue.
Yeah, and then there's another one that perhaps, Julia, you could take as well, from Anne-Katrin. Gene pool fungi lichens in a fragmented Swedish forest landscape. I have been thinking about how prescribed burning in nature reserves actually decreases the genetic pool of local fungi and lichens. Wouldn't it be better to burn the surrounding former clear-cut plantations around the reserve instead? Would be interesting to hear how you apply this factor in your planning process.
Yeah, I think Anders and I will try to answer it together. But firstly, we're a bit restricted being a life-funded project because we're conducting our burn sites in Natura 2000 areas, and they are usually nature reserves. So that's why we are conducting our prescribed burnings in nature reserves, basically. But perhaps you can reply more regarding the fungi and lichen perspective, because I think there is something in your proposition here. What do you say, Anders?
Well, I think it really comes down to how much do we burn.
Yeah.
We've been burning in my country, we've been burning for 25 years. We've done 48 burns of a total of 850 hectares. Now, the amount of forests, the pine forest that needs to burn or should burn, have burned in Dalarna is probably something like 30,000 hectares. So with the big picture, we burn only a fragment of what has naturally burned. So I think as substrates, we have lots of substrates left in the protected areas that we're actually burning. So I don't see it as a big question.
No, I don't think it's a high risk that we actually delete populations. But we do inventories. So if there are specific species that we find and that are very rare, we try to perhaps we change the burning site, like the borders of it.
And also we protect the substrates, logs, and snags, and stumps with all these species, so they will remain intact within the unit.
All right, then perhaps tied a bit to that, but let's double check, I think is the question from Miriam that I generally very much agree. There was also another question actually about the theory of change being limited kind of to the biophysical changes in the system. Miriam is asking, I'm interested in if there are any best practice examples of how to build acceptance and trust with the local communities. How are they supposed to understand the long-term goal when people have forgotten what a real forest looks like?
Exactly, yeah.
So perhaps you want to react first.
Yeah, well, I think that's the issue for all of us working with nature conservation and protected areas, that we have to work a lot with communication and describing what a natural forest is and what a managed forest is, because people generally think that those high production forests are the natural ones, and that the natural forest actually looks rather messy. So I think that's a communication task that we have in all the county boards and companies working with nature conservation. And it's definitely something that we want to highlight during the project to spread knowledge on.
Yeah, and perhaps then tied to that, so the reason why this theory of change is, I answered, I think, in text as well, but is limited to these biophysical effects on the system and kind of the direct restoration measure in the field, is not that we think both the social aspects around burning and or human well-being are not relevant. Of course, it's extremely relevant. Definitely. But it was not part of this analysis, because what we wanted to learn about is how to design the fire in the best possible way given particular conditions, and also what kind of effects, how these effects build on each other, et cetera, et cetera. So we're sure we're running the field action in the way that we think it has the biggest effect. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And we're working with the socioeconomic analysis starting from this autumn and winter. So the coming years, we will have a specific focus on that in the project as well.
All right, great. That is a really helpful clarification, I think. Then there's one question, and I know we're getting kind of close to the end here, time-wise. One more question from Jan Sliva. Large parts of the taiga forests are located on originally rich soils, peat soils. What is your experience with burning taiga forests on peat soils, which are prone to long-lasting deep peat fires? Or are the forested peatlands excluded from your trials?
Yeah, I'd say we don't really burn forests on peat soils. Those are mostly spruce-dominated forests that either don't burn, or we just don't burn them because they wouldn't burn naturally. But I know that in Northern America, Canada, Russia, wildfires on peat soils peat soils is a big problem, but not what we've experienced in Sweden.
Okay, great. Then I think I'm kind of looking at you, Sarah, as well. Do we have time for another question, or should we slowly come to an end?
I think we do, if we can answer fairly briefly.
So perhaps that could be a nice one. Let's see, towards the end, because of course we started out with, the question, for what reason, or what is your context coming to this webinar? Are you performing prescribed burning as a restoration measure or to decrease fire risk and so on? And I think there's more a comment than a question here, but I'm interested in Julia, and Anders, your reaction to it. Sadiq Seinalov is saying, I think we can agree that prescribed burning is a main tool for fire prevention. Well, it obviously can help with restoration, but we can't put aside the fire problem, especially in the context of fire paradox. So I'm curious, because perhaps the taiga ecosystem is a bit special, and also the Life2Taiga project in that regard. But I'm interested in your reaction to that, how you think about fire as a restoration measure versus a risk prevention measure.
Well, in Sweden, we haven't had huge issues with wildfires. Maybe the last 10 years, it started to become an issue. But obviously, we have a problem with fuel load buildups. We don't really experience that though, since our summers are still very wet. I think that is most towards the Mediterranean countries, where you really see big fires, big wildfires, and where prescribed burn really is a tool for that fire prevention so far. But I think the issue will become bigger in Sweden should the summers dry out more.
All right. Then from my side, I'll hand over to you, Sarah, in a second. But from my side, again, thanks so much for, on the one hand, making time today, for the great questions and the really active participation in this webinar. And of course, also for the great talks of all the colleagues. That was really a great experience. So from my side, thank you for this. Handing over to you, Sarah.
Yes, thanks very much. That brings us to the end of this webinar. We have opened up the chat again, so we encourage you to share what's on the top of your head here after these past 75 minutes. Tell us what you're taking away from this. Thank you to the audience for your attention and your excellent questions. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out, or if you have any topics in conservation or restoration that you think could benefit from a collaborative learning approach, we're very happy to talk about that and share what we know. Thank you to our fantastic speakers for sharing your insights with us, and to the Life2Taiga team overall from FOS Europe for such a rewarding project. It's been really great. Again, we will share this recording within the next couple of weeks. Everybody who signed up will get an email, and we'll also add it to that web article that Linnea just posted. Thanks for making us look good, Linnea. Thank you all, and see you next time.